When you think about Japanese art in your mind's eye, you probably think of something looking a lot like the next two pieces that we're going to talk about. So the first is Red and White Plum Blossoms. The artist is Ogata Korin, and we're looking at the dates 1710 to 1716. Now, first let's talk about just the form of this. All right, a couple of things about the form. First of all, just notice that while you will see many images of this as just sort of a flat image, these were actually going to be screens. So rather tall screens, about the height of a an adult human, and meant to be placed in a room sort of as a divider. So, and at this angle like this. So you do have Corin paints it to be a 3D installation, so not meant to be just sort of a flat, to interact with it in this kind of flat way. Now let's look at what we actually see. Corin is painting a springtime scene. We have a river or a stream, and the angle of this is this very, very extreme one. Like you have to think about where would you have to be to see a stream sort of receding up at this way, up the picture plane, right? It's kind of has this unnatural upward tilt. The colors are these very, very, sort of hyper-saturated jewel tones. There's this gold leaf in the background, which means that there's like no modulation here, right? Like what time of day is this? It's very, you couldn't necessarily tell. It just sort of has this wash of gold in the background. There's no outlines, right? No hard outlines, contour lines on the trees or the water, although there are these abstract kind of patterning in the water to suggest swirling currents or even little waves, and the same in the bark of the cherry trees. We have these kind of washes of color, right? As we said, of jewel-toned colors, and then so the kind of effect here is a sort of abstract, very flat sort of look, and yet this interplay with the intense realism of the rendering of the trees, right? That we have the trees looking very much like a gnarled cherry tree would look, with the sort of branches springing off in this way, the little blossoms on both sides. So this really interesting interplay, right, between different ways of representing nature. And Korin is considered to be the greatest artist of the Rimpa school. Now, what's interesting about this is that it wasn't actually a school of art. It's not like when we talk about, like, say, the K school, for example, within the Kamakura period, where that was a group of artists who all sort of followed a certain philosophy of how to make art. Rather, this was just sort of began about 100 years prior, so in the 1600s, of just artists who were all working with similar kinds of themes, but didn't necessarily choose to affiliate themselves with one another. And Korin is using those same kinds of ideas, and is considered to be the greatest example of this. Of the folks who are working in this way. And what is that about? It's this interplay of form, right? Kind of these really these forms that are stripped down to just the most essential elements, of color, as we see, and of texture. The texture in the water, the texture in the tree. So the other thing to know about Korin is that this work is going to have a lot of influence on our European artists that we're going to look at later. So particularly, I have an example here of Gustav Klimt, right? And you can see this is Portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer, and you can see again, right? The image of this woman on the one hand, stripped down, right? We don't have it's not necessarily a completely realistic form in terms of her dress, right? And yet the face is, and this really, really, this great interest in the different textures, and how they work together, and indeed this sort of flat, gold background. Now, here is a work of art that if in your mind's eye you were going to think Japanese art, you probably, even if you didn't know what this was called or who painted it or who made it, you'd think, oh yeah, the Great Wave, Under the Wave off Kanagawa. So this is Katsushika Hokusai, who has made this work of art. It is a polychrome woodblock print. So that means the way that this would be made is the artist, Hokusai, would create the drawing first, then a carver would carve this into a woodblock, one woodblock for each color that's used in the print, and then it would be printed off and published. Now, we have in here the thousands of copies would be made of this. Thousands of cheap copies would have been made of this. So and we'll talk a little bit more about what movement this is part of, but this, while we probably consider this to be this example of, Japanese fine art, at the time, it was really popular art. It was something that a tourist to the city would buy as like a souvenir, right? It's not at the time it wasn't considered to be like, great art, but that's just another interesting thing to think about how conventions of what fine art changes over time. So Hokusai did a whole series of that was called 36 Views of Mount Fuji, and we see Mount Fuji here in the background. Of these 36, the Great Wave is probably the most famous out of the 36, but you've probably seen some of the others as well. And we see in this the school that Hokusai is a part of is called ukiyo-e. Now, ukiyo-e means the floating world. And what that refers to is these block prints that are made during the Edo period in Japan. And this is a time when people start living in cities, enjoying secular, cosmopolitan life, much to the chagrin of the ruling Tokugawa shogunate, who would like them to be more temperate and, reserved. But people are going to cities and they're enjoying the sorts of things that cities have to offer, entertainment, things like that. And the floating world is that. Ukiyo-e means like the ephemera of life, that you just kind of enjoy the moment. All right. And so what we see in ukiyo-e prints is this emphasis on line. So while on the one hand, we do have the same kind of flatness that you saw in the red and white plum blossoms, we definitely have very, very strong outlines here. Right? So emphasis on line, on pure, bright color, distilling form to its most important elements, right? So even, again, similar in that way to red and white plum blossoms, distilling the form to its most important elements, but the mode of execution is very different. And there's a kind of playfulness here too, right? Even though this is a series on Mount Fuji is way off here in the background and almost seems like it's going to be engulfed by this wave, right? Now, we also see kind of some contrasts that Hokusai is playing with, of sort of what this extreme near ground over here, and then the Mount Fuji in the background. We also have the contrast between the natural world and then the world of man, right? These fishing boats that are about to be swallowed up in this wave. Now, when Hokusai chooses this topic of Mount Fuji, it's not just because he really liked Mount Fuji, but because he knew it was going to sell well. He knew that visitors to the city, these are Japanese visitors from out in the country, would really enjoy something like this. So do keep that in mind. And he was interested in the commercial side of these things as well. Now, in addition to the great popularity of prints like this in Japan, these were also very, very popular in the West. So when the 1850s roll around and, Japan was previously isolated by the Tokugawa shogunate was about the isolation of Japan, like keeping foreigners out. By 1850, Commodore Perry of the U.S. Navy, and I'm using air quotes again, opened Japan to the West, and we start to see, Japanese art influencing Western art. Oh, I should also mention one thing. While the Tokugawa shogunate closed Japan to the West, they did still allow trade with the Dutch. So Hokusai was also influenced by Dutch art, and from that he was very interested in this in a single point perspective, and you see that here in this image as well. In terms of what this influenced in the West later on, we do see Impressionists and post-Impressionists really interested in Japanese art. And here we see it was actually a movement called Japanese, and here we see some Toulouse-Lautrec. This is Divan Japonais, and while of course the color, the color scheme is very different. This is very warm as opposed to this being very cool. You can see these this distillation of forms, this emphasis on the bright color, pure bright color, right? You can sort of see a similar quality to it, and then these hard outlines here. All right, that is that.